On Monday, January 17, 1944, during the final critical stretch of World War II, General Erwin Rommel stood on a cold and windswept section of the French coastline, studying the rising Atlantic tide as waves crashed violently against rows of wooden obstacles and steel spikes planted across the beaches. At that moment, he was not the daring desert commander celebrated for his North African campaigns, but the newly appointed commander of Army Group B, responsible for defending the Western Front from the inevitable Allied invasion that he believed would decide the future of Germany. The day marked the beginning of his relentless effort to warn Berlin that the coming storm in Normandy would become a disaster unless Germany fundamentally changed how it planned to fight it, and his warnings would echo through every staff conference, field inspection, and report he wrote in the months that followed as World War II moved toward its decisive turning point. From the first days of his command in France, Rommel approached the problem of defending Western Europe with analytical realism rather than ideology, studying weather patterns, terrain, artillery ranges, and logistical distances with the same determination he had once applied to desert warfare. His educational value to history lies in the way he combined tactical experience with strategic foresight. He concluded that Germany could not hope to defeat the invasion once Allied forces successfully landed and began moving inland, because Allied dominance in the air and sea would make maneuver warfare nearly impossible for German reserves. Therefore, Rommel argued that the only realistic chance to prevent catastrophe in World War II was to stop the invasion on the beaches within the first hours, before the Allies could build a stable bridgehead, and he dedicated himself to strengthening coastal fortifications accordingly. Rommel's inspection tours across France in early 1944 became a continuous exercise in discovering weaknesses and writing urgent memoranda warning of danger. He visited fortifications along the Pas de Calais, Normandy, and Brittany, often arriving unexpectedly, speaking directly with engineers, infantry officers, and artillery crews. What he saw disturbed him. Many defensive positions were incomplete, bunker fields were scattered and poorly connected, and obstacles across beaches and fields lacked depth and coordination. In his historically documented reports, Rommel emphasized that Allied bombers would isolate the battlefield by destroying communication lines and transportation networks, meaning German reinforcements located far inland would never arrive in time. He insisted that tanks and infantry must be positioned close to the coast, despite doctrinal resistance from other senior commanders, who still believed that armored reserves should be held back for a concentrated counterattack. The tension between these strategic philosophies created one of the most important debates within the German High Command during World War II. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and several staff officers favored a mobile defense model, holding armored divisions in reserve to strike the Allies after the main landing force revealed itself. Rommel, however, argued that modern warfare in 1944 no longer allowed such flexibility because Allied fighter-bombers would dominate the skies by daylight, destroying any German movement along roads or open terrain. In an educational sense, this disagreement illustrates how rapidly warfare evolved during World War II and how older strategic concepts collapsed under new technological realities. Rommel warned Berlin that a delayed counterattack would not simply be ineffective, it would be annihilated before reaching the front, turning the invasion into a one-sided disaster for Germany. Throughout the spring of 1944, Rommel continued writing memoranda and personal letters stressing the urgency of reinforcing beach defenses, laying additional minefields, constructing anti-tank ditches, and expanding networks of obstacles that would slow Allied vehicles. He traveled constantly, sometimes covering hundreds of kilometers per day in his staff car, while personally directing the placement of barriers across dunes, bridges, and potential landing zones. His reports to the German High Command were sober, factual, and grounded in operational analysis rather than optimism. He warned that Germany's industrial resources were weakening, fuel shortages were limiting mobility, and losses on the Eastern Front were draining manpower. These realities convinced him that Western Europe could not rely on prolonged campaign defense. Instead, he wrote that Germany must defeat the invasion on the first day, in the first hours, or risk facing a strategic collapse from which it could never recover in World War II. Rommel's warnings, however, were often diluted or ignored by political leadership inside Berlin. Adolf Hitler, increasingly isolated from battlefield realities, continued to believe that his own intuition superseded professional military judgment. He divided authority over armored reserves between multiple commanders, making rapid decision-making nearly impossible. Rommel recognized that this fragmented command structure would create confusion at the most critical moment of the war. Historically, this assessment proved accurate. His frustration was rooted not in personal ambition, but in a realistic understanding of how modern combined arms warfare required centralized coordination. In his educational correspondence, he stressed repeatedly that failure to unify authority would result in delayed responses, contradictory orders, and wasted opportunities at the very moment when Germany's survival in World War II depended on speed and clarity.
By April 1944, Rommel's sense of urgency intensified as he observed the growing presence of Allied air power dominating the skies above France on a daily basis. Bridges, railway stations, communication lines, and key road junctions were systematically targeted in preparation for the invasion. Every destroyed track, every collapsed bridge, and every cratered road confirmed what Rommel had been warning Berlin. German reinforcements would be paralyzed before they could maneuver. The educational importance of these months lies in the way his predictions aligned with broader strategic developments. He was not speculating, he was responding to visible evidence. When he wrote that the invasion would become a disaster if Germany failed to destroy Allied forces at the waterline, he based his judgment on field observations and operational logic shaped by his experience throughout World War II. Despite internal resistance, Rommel succeeded in significantly strengthening portions of the Atlantic Wall. Miles of beaches were covered with anti-landing obstacles, steel tripods, and explosive traps designed to destroy incoming landing craft and tanks. He ordered farmers to flood fields in low-lying areas to hinder airborne landings, and he expanded layers of mines to unprecedented density. His defensive philosophy aimed to transform every meter of coastline into a lethal barrier that would break Allied units before they could organize. Yet even as he worked tirelessly to improve Germany's defenses, Rommel remained clear-eyed about the limits of these efforts. He warned Berlin that fortifications alone would not guarantee success. They required immediate, decisive counterattacks supported by unified command authority, something he feared Germany would not be able to achieve under existing political constraints during World War II. On Tuesday, June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy began, and Rommel's warnings materialized with devastating clarity. He was away from the front that morning, traveling to meet his family and report to Hitler, because poor weather conditions had led many officers to believe the Allies would not attack that day. When news of the landings reached German headquarters, confusion and delay gripped the chain of command. Air attacks crippled communication lines, armored reserves awaited authorization that arrived too late, and local units fought desperately without coordinated support. Everything Rommel had predicted about Allied air superiority, delayed counterattacks, and fractured decision-making unfolded across the beaches of Normandy. From an educational perspective, the invasion stands as a stark demonstration of how strategic misjudgment and internal disagreement can shape the outcome of a critical turning point in World War II.
When Rommel returned to the front and inspected the battlefield, he saw with painful clarity how his unheeded warnings had become reality. The Allies had secured a foothold along the beaches, rapidly constructing supply networks, unloading vehicles, and reinforcing positions. German counterattacks launched in fragmented waves were destroyed by overwhelming air and artillery fire before they could mass. Rommel reported to Berlin that Germany had lost its final opportunity to throw the enemy back into the sea. His assessment was not defeatism. It was a strategic acknowledgement that the balance of power in Western Europe had shifted irreversibly. In his later communications, he urged the leadership to consider political solutions to avoid further destruction, revealing how his thinking had evolved from tactical defense to broader concerns about the long-term survival of Germany in World War II.
Rommel's perspective after Normandy highlights an essential educational lesson about leadership under catastrophic conditions. Rather than clinging to unrealistic expectations, he confronted reality directly and warned that further resistance would only cost more lives without altering the outcome. His willingness to challenge illusions placed him in growing conflict with Hitler's rigid insistence on holding every inch of territory, regardless of consequences. This moral and strategic divergence defined his final months. Historically, Rommel became increasingly convinced that Germany's leadership structure had failed and that its refusal to adapt would deepen the national disaster unleashed by World War II. His warnings thus evolved from operational assessments into broader ethical reflections on responsibility, duty, and the human cost of strategic denial. By the summer of 1944, Rommel's reputation within both German and Allied circles had shifted from that of a purely military commander to a figure symbolizing professional realism in the face of political extremism. His earlier campaigns in North Africa had earned him respect, but his conduct in France revealed something more significant, a commander willing to confront uncomfortable truths rather than hide behind ideology. The educational importance of his Normandy warnings lies not only in their accuracy, but in the courage required to voice them. His recognition that Germany could not win by prolonging destruction placed him at odds with leadership that prioritized symbolic resistance over practical outcomes. In the broader narrative of World War II, Rommel's warnings stand as evidence of how internal dissent emerged even within the highest levels of the German military. Rommel's story after Normandy also reflects the tragic consequences of political paranoia within authoritarian systems. His communications, conversations, and growing skepticism toward Hitler's leadership eventually brought him under suspicion. After being implicated by association with those connected to the July 20 plot, Rommel was confronted by emissaries who presented him with an ultimatum: accept a staged death to protect his family, or face public trial and repercussions against those close to him. His forced death later that year marked the final chapter of a commander who had spent his last months warning desperately against catastrophe. In an educational sense, his fate illustrates the personal risk faced by those who attempted to speak honestly within a regime unable to accept reality during World War II. Yet Rommel's warnings about Normandy did not vanish with his death. They entered the historical record as a case study in strategic foresight, leadership integrity, and the consequences of ignoring professional military judgment. Historians continue to analyze his memoranda, reports, and field assessments to understand how he recognized the inevitability of disaster before the invasion occurred. His experience serves as a reminder that warfare is shaped not only by technology and numbers, but by the willingness of leaders to confront truth and adapt. In the context of World War II, Rommel's attempt to prevent disaster highlights the tension between realistic strategy and ideological rigidity, a tension that ultimately shaped the collapse of Germany's position in Western Europe. Today, when scholars, students, and audiences examine Rommel's role in the Normandy campaign, they do so not to romanticize a military figure, but to understand the complex interplay of strategy, politics, and responsibility in times of crisis. His warnings stand as a historical lesson in critical thinking, showing how even experienced commanders can be undermined by political interference and delayed decision-making. The educational value of his story rests in its demonstration that foresight alone is not enough. It must be paired with institutional willingness to listen. Within the broader timeline of World War II, Rommel's efforts to warn Germany about the approaching disaster in Normandy remain one of the most revealing examples of leadership confronting the limits of power, and of a commander who tried, however unsuccessfully, to prevent a catastrophe he saw coming long before the first Allied landing craft reached the shore.
As the summer of 1944 progressed, Rommel's perspective on the strategic situation in Western Europe became increasingly shaped by first-hand observation of the devastation unfolding across French towns, countryside, and defensive positions. Each day brought new reports of encircled German units, shattered transport columns, and exhausted formations struggling against relentless Allied pressure backed by overwhelming air superiority. Rommel traveled across the collapsing front, speaking directly with junior officers and field commanders, listening to their accounts of mounting casualties, fuel shortages, and the inability to maneuver during daylight without suffering catastrophic losses from Allied fighter bombers. What he witnessed reinforced everything he had warned about before the invasion, that Germany's defensive doctrine had failed to adapt to the realities of modern warfare in World War II. In his communications following the early stages of the Normandy campaign, Rommel emphasized that the German army in France was being worn down through attrition rather than decisive engagement. He recognized that the Allies were not seeking a single dramatic breakthrough at first, but were instead grinding down German strength through sustained pressure, artillery bombardment, and constant aerial interdiction. From an educational standpoint, Rommel's analysis reveals a sophisticated understanding of operational warfare. He saw that the Allies were applying an industrial strategy to the battlefield, combining logistics, production capacity, and technology into a coordinated system that Germany could no longer match in the later stages of World War II. His warnings therefore evolved beyond tactical concerns and became broader reflections on the structural imbalance between the two sides. Rommel's attempts to communicate this reality to Hitler and the German High Command became increasingly tense and emotionally charged. In conferences and written reports, he argued that Germany must recognize the futility of continuing prolonged resistance in France and instead seek a political solution to prevent total destruction inside the country and across the continent. He warned that the longer the fighting continued, the greater the suffering of civilians and soldiers alike, and that Germany risked losing not only territory, but its future as a functioning nation. These statements reflected a profound shift in his thinking during World War II. Earlier in his career, Rommel had been a determined battlefield commander, focused primarily on tactical success. By 1944, he had become a strategic realist, grappling with the moral implications of continuing a war that he believed could no longer be won. This transformation in Rommel's outlook also highlights an important educational lesson about the relationship between military professionalism and political authority. His increasing willingness to challenge Hitler's decisions revealed a growing divide between military reality and ideological determination. Rommel argued that leadership required responsibility to both soldiers and civilians, and that blindly ordering further resistance at all costs was neither courageous nor rational. His perspective placed him among a small number of senior officers who recognized that Germany's military position in World War II had become irreversible. Yet, unlike some figures in the resistance movement, Rommel did not initially belong to any organized conspiracy.
His descent grew organically from his direct battlefield experience and his increasing awareness of the consequences of continued fighting. As Allied forces broke through German defenses during the Battle of Normandy and launched the encirclement operations that would culminate in the Falaise Pocket, Rommel again attempted to persuade Berlin to authorize a strategic withdrawal to avoid total annihilation of Germany's remaining forces in France. He warned that delay would result in entire divisions being destroyed, leaving the Western Front fatally weakened. His appeals, however, were either rejected or postponed, reflecting the regime's unwillingness to abandon territory, even when operational logic demanded it. The collapse that followed confirmed the accuracy of his predictions, as German units were trapped, destroyed, or forced into disorganized retreats under constant Allied pursuit.
By this stage, Rommel's warnings had taken on a deeply personal tone, reflecting both frustration and sorrow. He spoke openly to trusted colleagues about his fear that Germany was approaching national catastrophe, not only militarily, but socially and morally. He believed that a responsible leader could not ignore the suffering of soldiers being sent into hopeless battles or the devastation inflicted on cities and civilians. His reflections after the Normandy disaster illustrate a crucial educational dimension of World War II, the internal conflict faced by professional officers who recognized the widening gap between military necessity and political ideology. Rommel's growing moral unease and strategic realism did not go unnoticed by the regime. His critical reports, his advocacy for negotiations, and his distance from Hitler's worldview made him a figure of suspicion among those who remained fiercely loyal to the dictator. As the political atmosphere inside Germany darkened after the July 20 assassination attempt, even respected commanders found themselves under scrutiny. Rommel's earlier reputation for success in North Africa and his popularity among German soldiers and civilians could no longer shield him from suspicion. His name appeared in the context of conversations about opposition circles, not necessarily because he had actively participated in their planning, but because his views had moved away from unquestioning loyalty. In the final months of his life, Rommel faced a crossroads that highlighted the tragic human dimension of leadership under a collapsing regime during World War II. Isolated, watched, and increasingly aware that his position had become precarious, he confronted a future in which his conscience, his duty to his family, and his sense of responsibility to Germany collided in irreversible ways. When he was ultimately presented with the ultimatum that forced his death, the moment symbolized the fate of a commander who had attempted to speak truth to a leadership that refused to accept reality. His death marked the end of one of the most complex and debated figures of the war, a man both shaped by and ultimately broken within the system he served. Yet the educational significance of Rommel's warnings about the Normandy disaster extends far beyond his personal fate. His experience illustrates how strategic insight, however accurate, can fail to influence outcomes when political leadership is rigid, centralized, and insulated from reality. It demonstrates how authoritarian systems suppress internal criticism, even when that criticism is grounded in professional expertise and tactical necessity. In the broader historical study of World War II, Rommel's legacy forces scholars and students alike to confront difficult questions about responsibility, loyalty, and truth in wartime leadership. Today, his warnings are examined not merely as predictions of military failure, but as reflections of a broader struggle between rational assessment and ideological belief. They highlight the importance of adaptability, evidence-based decision-making, and open communication within military organizations. They also remind us that the outcome of great conflicts is not determined solely by weapons and numbers, but by whether leaders possess the courage to confront reality, even when it contradicts their expectations or challenges their authority. In the years after World War II, Rommel's warnings about the Normandy disaster became a subject of extensive historical study, not only because they accurately anticipated the outcome of the Allied invasion, but because they revealed the profound structural weaknesses within Germany's military and political system. Scholars examining his memoranda, field reports, and correspondence have emphasized that Rommel was not simply reacting to battlefield trends in isolation. Rather, he was engaging in a broader intellectual effort to reinterpret Germany's defensive doctrine in light of technological change, logistical constraints, and shifting strategic realities. His insistence that the invasion must be defeated at the shoreline emerged from a rigorous evaluation of air power, mobility, terrain, and resource availability during the late stages of World War II. Rommel's analysis has continued to serve as a valuable educational resource for military academies and strategic institutions, where his assessments are often studied as part of case discussions on defensive planning, inter-service coordination, and command decision-making under conditions of overwhelming enemy superiority. In these contexts, instructors emphasize that Rommel's core conclusion that outdated doctrine must yield to evolving conditions remains as relevant today as it was in 1944. His experience demonstrates that failure to adapt can transform even well-trained armies into vulnerable targets when technological and operational environments shift dramatically, as they did during World War II with the rise of integrated air and ground warfare. At the same time, historians have noted that Rommel's warnings also highlight the consequences of fragmented command structures and political interference in operational planning. The division of authority over armored reserves, the delayed approval of critical countermeasures, and the reluctance to empower field commanders created a delayed response framework that proved catastrophic in Normandy. From an educational standpoint, this aspect of Rommel's experience underscores the importance of unity of command, a principle widely stressed in modern military doctrine. His frustration at not being granted full operational control illustrates how even the most insightful strategic assessments can fail when institutional systems prevent rapid and coordinated implementation. Another dimension of continuing analysis surrounding Rommel's warnings concerns the ethical and moral implications of leadership in wartime. His post-Normandy appeals for a negotiated political settlement, grounded in the recognition that Germany could not reverse the course of events, have been interpreted as evidence of his growing moral awareness. He had come to understand that the persistence of futile resistance would only prolong suffering without altering strategic outcomes. This shift in perspective has sparked ongoing debate about his legacy, prompting historians to explore whether Rommel should be seen primarily as a pragmatic military professional, a reluctant dissenter, or a figure caught in moral conflict within an authoritarian regime during World War II. In many academic discussions, Rommel is presented as a case study in how personal conscience can evolve under the pressures of catastrophic defeat. Students analyzing his final months are encouraged to reflect on the tension between duty to command, responsibility to subordinates, and moral accountability to civilians affected by military decisions. His willingness to acknowledge that further fighting would lead only to unnecessary destruction represents a significant psychological departure from the aggressive operational mindset of earlier war years. This transformation remains one of the most historically instructive aspects of his life, demonstrating how experience, observation, and exposure to human suffering can reshape a commander's worldview during World War II.
Rommel's reputation in the post-war period also became intertwined with broader political and cultural narratives, both within Germany and internationally. In the early years after the war, he was frequently portrayed as a symbol of the apolitical professional soldier, partly because of his later opposition to Hitler's strategic decisions, and partly because of his forced death. Over time, however, historians have worked to present a more balanced and nuanced interpretation. They have emphasized that Rommel was not a simple heroic figure, but a complex individual shaped by ambition, loyalty, tactical brilliance, and evolving moral awareness. This more detailed historical approach enhances the educational value of his story by encouraging critical thinking rather than myth-making. Modern research has also expanded understanding of how Rommel's warnings about the Normandy disaster were documented, interpreted, and remembered. Archival material, interviews, and post-war testimonies have provided deeper insight into how his reports circulated within the German High Command, how they were received, and how shifting political priorities influenced their rejection. Scholars continue to examine the interplay between his operational recommendations and Hitler's strategic outlook, exploring the broader systemic failures that prevented Germany from responding effectively to the Allied invasion during World War II. For contemporary military professionals and students of strategy, Rommel's experience remains especially relevant in discussions of leadership under asymmetric conditions, where one side holds overwhelming technological, economic, or logistical superiority. His recognition that Germany could no longer match Allied industrial capacity led him to advocate for a strategy based on timing, concentrated defense, and early disruption of enemy landings. This approach reflected his broader understanding that strategic success in modern warfare depends as much on realism as on courage, and that the refusal to recognize imbalance can lead to catastrophic decision-making. Rommel's legacy also invites reflection on the personal cost of speaking uncomfortable truths in rigid political systems. His fate serves as a stark reminder that authoritarian regimes often treat honest analysis as disloyalty, especially when it challenges ideological assumptions or exposes strategic weakness. In this sense, his story extends beyond military history and enters the broader fields of political science, ethics, and leadership studies. It encourages students and researchers to consider how truth, responsibility, and power interact in environments where dissent carries severe consequences, a theme that resonates far beyond the context of World War II. Today, when historians revisit Rommel's warnings about the Normandy disaster, they do so with an awareness that his story embodies both strategic insight and human tragedy. His accurate predictions did not prevent defeat. His attempts to urge political negotiation did not change policy, and his moral awakening did not protect him from suspicion. Yet, the enduring significance of his experience lies in the lessons it offers to future generations, that realism must guide strategy, that leadership requires honesty even in the face of risk, and that ignoring informed warnings can shape the course of history. In the broader narrative of World War II, General Erwin Rommel's efforts to warn Germany about the approaching disaster at Normandy stand as a powerful and enduring reminder of the importance of critical thinking, adaptability, and moral responsibility in times of conflict. His story continues to be studied not only as a military episode, but as a timeless examination of leadership under pressure, a reflection of how foresight, courage, and truth can emerge even in the midst of a war already spiraling toward inevitable and irreversible defeat.